Banshee Go Bragh. The gent behind the bar hollered, "Sit anywhere you please." But Shannon didn't hear him. Rather, she couldn't hear him. It wasn't called the clangy clover for word. I'm not allowed to say on this channel, and giggles, but a grouping of drunkies and a roaring fire just beneath a window, still being weaved in streaks of lane water wasn't the reason why. Shannon couldn't hear at all. She was deaf, but she didn't need to be so told to sit anywhere she pleased. She could do that all on her own. "You're a Yank, ain't ya?" The gent beside the bar now wasn't. He was standing beside her at the little booth tucked just beneath the windowsill beside the fireplace. That fire had caught her attention with all its crackling and popping like a tiny fireworks show, and she didn't look up at him until the menu and napkins slid across her table. She made a face somewhere between a smile and a grimace, and motioned with her hand as if she were writing on an invisible paper that was floating in the air. But Gent was confused at first. He reached into his apron and pulled out a measly green pen. She nodded fervently, took it, and on one of the napkins scribbled something. She turned it to face him. And the gent raised two eyebrows and nodded down at her. "Can you read whips?" He sounded like a tourist trying to talk to a native outside of their native tongue. Fortunately for him, she nodded. "By the luck of the Irish," he said, and he pointed over to a sign labeled "Specials" and smiled. It certainly was a special day for someone, that being it was the feast of St. Patrick, March 17th, and the list of the day's options reflected that corned beef, cabbage, coconut, boxties, and stew, all of which were typical there, yet for a Yank from the States it was just about as special as having a leprechaun being shoved up your butt. Shannon took a quick glance at the sign and began jotting, and not a moment later, but the napkin read plainly, "Stew." The gent nodded, but before he could turn around, she grabbed the napkin and wrote something else. "No onions. We make it in a crock," he said, "so I can't go and give you no onions. Besides, who the frick doesn't like onion in their stew? That's a crock." He smiled up at him and nodded understandingly. "You still want it?" he asked. She made a knocking motion with her hand and nodded alongside it, and the gent meandered into the kitchen. Shannon sat silently, cleared her throat after a sharp cough, and looked around the place. Clearly, there was some kind of music playing. She couldn't darn well hear it, but the fellow at the booth behind her was tapping his toe to pretty hardly in 6/8 time. She smiled. A couple of guys were clinking their pins at the bar. A bearded one shuffling a deck of cards. And just behind him, a woman danced a soft jig. "Here's that stew," the gent said, sitting it just before her at the table. "I tried me darndest to get a scoop with no onion. Tell me how you like it." She pressed her finger to her chin and lowered them down at him before lifting the spoon out of the bowl and swallowing a nip. It was nice and warm, much like the place she had found herself in on such a cold wintry night, and it was rather heavy on the potatoes, yet obviously she expected as much. She grabbed the pen and napkin and wrote again. It's I thought you'd like it. The gent smiled, flashing a set of yellow teeth. It's me mammy's rat. He was about to go on when a single shrill wail from just beyond the rain-patterned window brought him to silence. Ah! It was almost so faint that he couldn't even hear it. But when the same scream, still muffled by the glass, but clearly closer now, rang through the joint again, he froze. And though he could peer out into the night, he couldn't see anything. Shannon continued to look up at him with bewilderment and lifted both of her hands from her chest, a single silver spoon dangling from beneath her thumb and fingers like a cigar. He looked from beyond the window back down at her, but couldn't speak. His heart, too, was thumping in 6/8 time. And he was about to ask her if she had heard it, but already knew her answer, and a quick glance around the place answered the second question on his mind. It's me mammy's recipe, he finished, spitting it out like the plague. He was about to walk away, but his knees grew weak, nearly buckling, so he sat down across from her at the booth and dug the scrub off his chin into his knuckles, which were worn and smelled of giddiness. The pub, which only seconds earlier was cuddled in the warmth of the crackling fire, was now chilled as the night outside, at least to him. Now seated across from the man, Shannon stared the stranger dead in the eyes as she wrote something else on the same dinner napkin, freshly smeared in beer broth and lipstick. What's wrong? But Gent shook his head and looked around the place. Everyone was going about laughing and drinking and dancing as usual. No one else had heard the scream. Smite, the gent said, hushed under his intoxicated breath. He turned back to face the woman, but his attention was drawn to the large clump of matted hair floating in her stew. Something beneath it was bubbling, and once the gravy brown color of broth was now a deep red that reeked like rusted metal. He was about to gag just as the hair began to sink back into the contents of the bowl, and that's when the ghastly white face of a woman emerged from the bubbling broth, her mouth wide and filled with the same gurgling sound she was screaming. Ah! The giant was too. Ah! From around the pub, several grunts were made in the man's direction. However, considering the occasion and the reputation of such a place as the Clangley Clover, a bit of hollering wasn't going to surprise anyone, aside from maybe a couple of tourists dressed in all green and sticking out like a sore thumb in the opposite corner. Men had been killing for wearing such a shade. Men had been killed for wearing such a shade. I never glanced down at the bowl, and the face was gone, replaced once again with a woman's stew, still steaming. The woman, whom he'd later come to know as Shannon, hadn't noticed the entire ordeal, but her face was flushed off, all at once inviting. Warm color as if she had. She was staring out through the hazy window and if Irish eyes could smile, her were most definitely shouting. When he saw that awful expression on his face, the giant lightly grasped her shoulder and she jolted at the touch. Gather yourself, he said. She puffed 4 rapid breaths, coughed into her sleeve, and placed her hand over until she calmed. You right? She nodded and grabbed a pen. There's someone out there. Who? He was staring at her like he was shooting darts. She wrote, a woman. Was she screaming? Yes, Shannon swallowed and lifted the pen again, more hesitantly than before. I don't know. Why? Vigent asked. She didn't have a head. Vigent combed his scraggly gray hair with his hands, which were now trembling. He reached into his apron pocket again. The same one which once housed the little green pen, and pulled out a small bottle of Jameson. He chugged it. Meanwhile, as he did, the woman reached for her spoon. She had well lost her appetite, but she supposed there was some sort of comfort to be found in a hot meal. Don't, the man said. She couldn't hear him, so he waved his hands at her, and when they locked eyes again, he said again, Don't. She grabbed a napkin. Why? Onion, he croaked, and for a second was relieved by the sound of his own laughter until it turned into a fit of coughing. She wasn't laughing, though, and again she lifted the napkin. Why? The gent sighed. Why are you here? Shannon stared at him silently and then looked at the napkin once more. This time, she held it up for longer. I can read, the man said. I'll answer that when you answer me. Why are you here? She took the napkin and, still looking at him, scribbled something. Looking for someone. He just attempted to suck whatever he could from the empty Jameson bottle and was only met with the fumes of wicker ghost. Who? She wrote. Who? She wrote. Family. You got family in the Emerald Isles? Your clan? She wrote again, this time on the back, since the font was nearly covered. My parents. Your parents, he said, clearing his throat with a chuckle. What are they doing in Ireland? She was already answering his question, and as she wrote, she nearly choked on her own spit. She was sick. Clearly, in that fair skin of hers, which you assumed was from Irish blood, might have been another telltale sign of that. That's what I'm trying to find out. The gent nodded and pushed the bowl from between them to the end of the table. Glancing out the window again, the rain had stopped, and just before he was about to sigh, a flash of lightning and the immediate crack of thunder rolled through the place. Not that it would shut any of the drunkards up, of course. You an orphan? He asked, and the woman nodded. What's your Christian name? She flipped over the napkin. Why? He stared at her. I just want to know, he finally said. And I'll tell you what I know. She wrote. Shannon. The gent bowed his head, leaning forward and extended a still trembling hand. Daniel O'Brien. Call me Danny. She shook it, though, somewhat hesitantly, as the man tightly gripped her hand in his. After he rested his arm along the table, he sighed and stroked his chin. You ever heard of a banshee? Of a banshee? He took the pen and napkin from her and wrote the word down. Banshee. She Banchee. She shook her head and pointed to the word still scribbled on a sheet just below his. Why? Because you frickin' asked, he chuckled, though his voice was robbed of any joy. And again the laughter ended in a harsh swell of hacking. Shannon nodded her head, and he continued. A banshee is an Irish spirit. Me mammy told me the legend when I was a wee little one. She said that the banshee scream, if you heard it, meant one of your clan was gonna die. Shannon squinted, but didn't do anything but sit there. She didn't need to write anything. Her face said it all. I know, Danny said. I know. Stop looking at me like that. Shannon blinked only once. Danny sighed, and then he laughed. It was a hoarse laugh. I might be a wee bit drunk, he said for parted lips, but I'm not that drunk. There was a silence between the two of them again, and that was Shannon who was staring darts into the eyes of Danny. They were reddened eyes, strained, dilated, and bulging with tired veins. He didn't say a word, yet those eyes spoke a million until it was his turn again. How do you know your parents were in Donnybrook? Shannon turned and peered out the window again, watching as the post-rain fog rolled across the dewy glass. She looked at him and lifted the napkin, pointing to the word he had written. Banshee. We'll get back to her. He nodded, patting the wooden table and still trembling, but calmer than before. Right now we're talking about you. Still looking dead at him, Shannon slapped something on to the table between them. She lifted the flat palm of her hand and revealed a box of playing cards inscribed with the name. He lifted the box just as Shannon began jotting something else. His eyes began to swell as, again, he coughed. But that was not the reason why. On the side of the little white and green box, a string of letters, plainly read, Women at Dublin, made in Ireland. Before he could comment, Shannon slid the napkin towards him. It said, This was my father's stag. A full set except for the free clubs. It was made here in Dublin. I'd like to finally meet him and my mother. I'm sick. Danny smiled a shy grin, which was unbefitting of him, given his brashness up to that point. He reached into his pocket, not the apron, but his actual pants pocket, and pulled something out, smacking it against the table. He sighed, and that timid little smile vanished off his cheeks. Then he lifted his trembling hand to reveal a free of clubs. Shannon instantly slapped him across the face. It was a knee-jerk reaction and was only followed by a sea of tears falling out of her eyes. Danny was crying too, but that didn't stop him from speaking his mind. A once again familiar trait, most befitting of him. I deserve that, he said. You didn't, Shannon. Shannon, who was still choked up, pointed at the napkin now soaked in her own teeth. Here's the word. Running with green ink still red. Why? I ask myself that every night, Danny said with a sniffle. If I find an answer, I'll tell you. Shannon jotted something, biting her lip. She was afraid of the word she was inscribing into that paper. Where's Mom? All Danny could do was shake his head, and she knew right away what he meant. Now was the last time I had heard the Banshee. I begged the Lord that I'd never hear her cry again. After a silent moment, which, mind you, was still just as clingy as the clover, he lifted the free of clubs and held it tightly beneath his pincers. His voice was stronger now. You ever wonder why it's got a free of clubs? He asked, tapping the shape beneath the number with his finger. That's a shamrock. Shannon didn't respond. She wanted answers, not more questions. What happened to her mother? Why didn't they leave her? Was the Banshee going to kill her? And for some strange reason now, what's with a free of clubs? Pretty funny when something's hidden in plain sight, Danny said, lowering his voice to a whisper, even though that didn't make any difference to his deaf daughter. In the States, the Yanks call it no lads in black or some crap, but here in Aaron, it's the club, both 'cause of this. He said, tapping the clover shape, and 'cause if you tell a soul about it, they'll club your butt to death. Shannon shook her head in confusion. Danny looked over to the bearded man playing Cosby outside the bar and then back to Shannon. That's Connor Ferguson, he said. Two of clubs. I'm free. We aren't like the Yanks, he said, brows furrowed. This isn't a government job. We're like a militia against the fair folk. Shannon shook her head again. She didn't understand, but how could she? Danny pounded the table and held two fingers high above his head. Not a moment after the beard fell. Connor Ferguson, as he called him, clinked two green beers onto the table. Who's the last, boyo? Connor Ferguson grinned back at her with a smile, but Shanson wasn't replicating it. He swallowed and turned back to Danny. Want me to deal you in, Danny boy? Danny shook his head and Connor, rather confusedly, meandered back to the drunken bunch of gamblers while whistling Danny boy to himself. Taking one last glance over his shoulder at Shannon, his eyes looked familiar, perhaps from a memory that she couldn't remember. Her mother, God rest her soul, died in this place 45 years ago today. Connor was here from very beginning, Danny said. Shannon continued to wear her confused expression, and Danny chuckled. What, you think I dreamed of being a barter? Not much bartering to do when you're protecting your clan from the fair folk. Shannon grabbed the napkin and pen and began scribbling again. Danny tapped it and caught her attention. He pointed to the beer before. You better drink up, he smiled. Shannon continued writing. Who are the fair folk? Frickin' Yanks, Danny muttered under his breath. Fair folk are the fairies. Shannon's eyes lit up. Yeah, you read me what's right, but they ain't frickin' Tinkerbell, Shanny. They're bogarts, goblins, and, yeah, banshees. No, not all of them is bad. Heck, take our Banshee out there, for example, he said, pointing to the window. She's what we call an omen. She only tells it as it is. Every clan has one. That's why when you see her, I knew you as me own flesh and blood. That's why no one else seen nor heard her cry, Shannon shouted toughly. It was a hard pill after all. I know you don't want to believe me. Believe me, I know. But your mother and I did what we did to protect you. Danny's lip quivered and he bowed his head. When she told me about you listening, he said, pointing to his ear, I thought, Lady Luck could stop smiling at us when we were young and we were scared. I thought your deaf ears were a curse. Shannon interrupted him and barely wrote, ripping them back napkin some in the process. They are. Danny shook his head. You were our greatest blessing, Shanny. You all are our greatest blessing. I'm sorry, we were so wanting to see it then, but I see it now. Danny's speech was interrupted by another high-pitched howl from outside. It was even closer than before, as if the thing's whip were now pressed against the window's foggy glass. He didn't look. He faced forward, and as he stared at his teary-eyed daughter, she coughed again. Only once, but she coughed hard enough to split blood onto her sleeve. She wiped it with the napkin. At that moment, Danny's Irish blood ran icier than it ever had, and immediately he reached down with his old and cold hands and embraced hers. They were cold too, but full of life. Is it bad? He asked. Shannon nodded without looking up at him, and Danny muttered something softly to himself. Perhaps a prayer or plea, either to God or the forsaken Banshee, and scooted up in the booth until his gut was pressed against the table. And this was the first time you seen her, the Banshee? Shannon bobbed her head, and Danny's lip parted into a smile. But now, there was joy in his demeanor. I remember when he was free, he said, his eyes glowing like emeralds. It was the last week we'd ever seen you, and all you wanted was a unicorn. He chuckled. Your mother told you there was no such thing, he said, reaching into his other pants pocket. but she was talking a load of blarney. Danny lifted his hand and placed a large golden horseshoe smack dab between them on the table. Shannon stared down at it with bewildered eyes. I got this from Scotland. I carry it around with me as a sign of good luck, Danny winked. But it was always meant for you, Shanny. Shannon lifted it to her watery eyes. It was heavy, and it glimmered louder than the fire. Before she could thank him, Danny had already placed another trinket on the table. "This is me die," he said, lifting his fingers, nudging a tiny white cube, dotted with 6 black dots atop it, towards his daughter. "It was with that dove I won your mother," he said, shrugging. "Well, not one, but well, we were both playing stuff for crap, and I let her, and I'll tell her let's go, and we did, and that's how you came along." Shannon nodded and picked up the die, rolling it around in the fingers of her hand, holding up the golden horseshoe with the other. Danny, who had grown more somber with an instant, held out his final charm. "This one's the most special," Danny said, lifting up a 3-leaf clover, a shamrock which was creased and wrinkled up, and had clearly seen sunnier days. "Most frickin' idiots will tell you the four-leafers are the lucky ones, but they're wrong, Shanny." He held out the tiny green plant and pointed to one of its droopy petals. "Father, Son, Holy Ghost," he said, extending it to her. "Patrick rid the Emerald Isle of serpents, and God's willin' will keep the other devils out." Shannon took the shamrock in her palm and looked up at her father as a single tear caressed the heat of her face. Danny smiled a tooth grin, and, for the last time, with a final bellowing cough from his lungs, he glanced over to the window and noticed the glaring white face of a woman, the same one from the stew, staring back at him. But Miss Banshee wasn't screaming, not anymore. Danny looked back to his daughter, pushed along some free clubs toward her from his side of the table, and said tenderly and hushed, "Good luck, Shanny." And with that, he keeled over onto the table and died.